Strassenger and graph. And I put a chart that will help us on page 78 when we fill that out at the end. But there's some good pictures in both, but we'll have key things we'll want to retain. Oh, I should have brought that little thing clear. Done by 1:30, and if we have any time, we'll review for the test. If not, we'll review tomorrow. If we have any time left. Okay, so tell me the vessels in order. Artery, afferent, peritubular capillaries, efferent. No, efferent peritubular capillaries.
Vasa
And
recta.
vasa recta, and then
The vein.
renal vein. So the abdominal aorta leads into the renal artery, and the renal vein goes into the inferior vena cava. But you only have to know from renal artery to renal vein. And you gotta be able to identify them on the chart, and you gotta be able to write them in order. Okay? So, the key, and when we're done, we're going to go through more information that you'll need for the test. But when we're done, we'll go through the key things you'll need for the test from this lecture. So we'll streamline it a lot when we get down to what you're going to need for the test. So tell me what you remember where filtration takes place.
Glomerulus.
Glomerulus, which is surrounded by Bowman's capsule, then leads into the proximal. Then where does reabsorption take place?
In the tubules.
All the tubules. And then there's active and passive reabsorption. You're going to have to know both, and you're going to have to fill out a chart similar to that, but only reabsorption. It won't have any. You won't have to put anything on a chart for secretion or filtration. We know the glomerulus basically is the primary area for filtration.
On exam too. The chart will be on exam too.
Yes, but this is all, if you want to put test 2, so you know you're not studying this for Wednesday. Remember, not everybody is lucky to get the Monday test, so it's life. You got to have extra material before you take even the test on the old material.
But the blood supply is very good.
Just the blood supply, just through number 1, okay? Then tell me, do you remember anything about secretion? Do you remember what the blood pH should be?
7.5. 4.
Hi.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody remember what blood pH is supposed to be?
7.4.
Around 7.4, 7.35, 7.45. Do you remember what gets reabsorbed to kind of make your blood pH a little bit more to the alkaline side? Like
Hydrogen
carbonate?
ion.
Okay. Well, then we're going to learn 2 things that take excess hydrogen. Have you noticed in lab what our common pHs have been for all of us? Acidic or alkaline? Acidic, right? Haven't all of you been below 7 when it's your urine? Okay. Well, your urine is more acidic because we have 2 processes that join to the extra hydrogen ions that come up from metabolism, and there's phosphate ion and ammonium ion is formed that is excreted, and it takes out the extra hydrogen. So your urine typically is going to be more acid. So there are going to be key things you're going to need to know from each 3 things: filtration, reabsorption, secretion. We'll narrow it down. Now Barb is going to get into heavy-duty acid-base balance when she gets the electrolyte lecture. you're gonna do a whole process of metabolic and respiratory acidosis and alkalosis with bar. We will not get into that at all. We'll just keep it strictly to what you have to know for the urine, okay? So there's the blood supply that we already went over. And one of the things I thought was really interesting, each book had something good to add. So there are 85% of your nephrons are primarily in the cortex, the outer part on the cross view. And you're right, the pyramids are on the medulla, but that's the inner part, the middle part of the cross view. They're only, and their job, the cortical nephrons, their job is to remove waste products and to reabsorb nutrients, okay? Those outer nephrons. The other set of nephrons, which make up basically 15%, are called juxtamedullary. And they have longer loops of Henle, and one of these books had a good picture of that. I'm going to show you that, what we're talking about. Because I thought some of their pictures were really good in these books.
I saw one on the internet, like one, the juxta one was like on one side and then they had like the regular on the other side.
Well, they just showed, the pictures showed leading, only some have the longer loops of Henle that go deep. This is an example of a juxtamedullary nephron that goes deeper into it, where it shows it going deeper down into the medullary area, but they're shorter. 85% have the shorter loops of Henle's that only stay up in the cortex. Okay? So, their job, those juxtamedullary ones, the ones that have the longer loop of Henle's, their big job is concentration of urine. And we're going to see that in the descending loop of Henle, water is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. Okay, the vasa recta that I get taught goes around the loop of Henle. In the ascending, you're going to have the sodium and chloride reabsorbed out of the filtrate into the bloodstream. And they call that tissues, before it gets to the bloodstream, the interstitium. Okay? So you're going to see the loop of Henle begins where it goes to the distal and the collecting duct on the final concentration of how concentrated your urine is. So this isn't anything that's going to be on a test so far. I'm just giving you some preview. So basically you have 1,200 mils per minute of blood flowing through in the renal blood flow. So probably 25% of your total blood is into the kidney at one time. So you're always looking to remove anything waste. So you can see if you have problems with your kidney and all the waste products are backing up, like the urea, the creatinine, the uric acid, how dangerous it becomes to you. Okay. So one of the things, some information kind of about the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. We already said the peritubular capillaries surround what on your diagram? Where are they surrounding? So which ones? So more the proximal and even the distal as it loops down and around the peritubular. And they provide immediate reabsorption of essential nutrients. So when we get to filling out that chart of what is reabsorbed in the proximal tubule, think of nutrients. It'll be glucose, amino acids. I think there's even a little urea. That's one of them. And then in the distal convoluted tubule, that's where you're going to get the final adjustment of what's in your filtrate. We'll have, we're going to get to, when we get to filtration, what is the role of aldosterone and ADH? Do you guys remember at all what aldosterone does for you and what ADH does for you? Which one reabsorbs what back into the bloodstream? Because you're going to have to know this for the test. So aldosterone reabsorbs sodium back into the bloodstream, and ADH reabsorbs water back into the bloodstream. So as we get through filtration, reabsorption, and secretion, those names will become, because we're going to talk about a system called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So that's coming. Now the vasa recta, it's adjacent to the ascending and descending loop of Henle. So those vessels are surrounding the loop of Henle. And this is where major exchanges of salt and water take place. So this, whenever you hear sodium chloride in the water, that is what helps to get your urine concentrated on your final urine. You know, what the specific gravity in our cases will be. Because not all of us get a thing called osmolarity done every urine you get, but all of us will have a specific gravity done when we get a urinalysis. So, you think of the paratubular capillaries as part of reabsorbing nutrients. You think of the vasa recta as part of reabsorbing water or the sodium chloride. And those are the key to concentrating urine. So if you think about what the blood systems do in the area they are. Okay, so you have three structures of filtration. And filtration, three, not structures, what I want to say, three things that help glomerular filtration. Anybody know them?
Cellular structure.
And that is through when in the Bowman's capsule that surrounds the glomerulus. So it's just the structure basically of the capillary walls. They say there's 8 capillary walls in the glomerulus, and then you have the Bowman's capsule that has those fenestrating pores. So the structure of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. So for instance, did you guys do strep test on? Do you have a question on it?
Yeah, it doesn't really relate to this, but earlier you said that it's 1,200 mils per minute to flow through the kidneys.
1,200 mils per minute is renal. It says renal blood.
But on your
1,200.
slide,
It's 1,200 mils per minute.
on your slide it says 120.
Let me see. Let me see if I have a typo, because I just wrote this. It says the means that a normal adult, the blood passes through the kidneys at a rate of 1,200 mils per minute. So if you want to add another 0, that'd be great. So thank you.
It's slide 8 in kidney structure function number 2.
Filters the blood indiscriminately at a rate of about 125 mils per minute.
This is page. Let me just read it. It's from here. It's from this book. I just read it to you. Because this is my Strassenger. No, this is my graph. We'll get it. It says 25% of the blood pumped through the heart at all times is received by the kidney. And it says the total renal blood flow is approximately 1,200 mils per minute.
Okay, so the
Total renal blood flow. So if you want to clarify that, total renal blood flow is 1,200 mils per minute. And that's per Strassenger on page 41. Okay. So the structures. So did you guys do strep the other day? That is one thing when we talk about acute glomerulonephritis, when we get into disease states, that is one of the things that can damage the glomerulus. And you will have protein spill in your urine that shouldn't be there, and it's dangerous. because major kidney problem, all relating to immune complexes, the antigens, antibodies that aren't removed from that strep infection. So when we get to disease stage, you're gonna see how that strep can relate to acute glomerulonephritis. The other thing it can relate to is rheumatic fever. You'll learn with Diane that it can damage the heart if those immune complexes aren't cleared and they get attached to, your body sees them as foreign and they get attached and attack the heart tissue. So that would be an example of how you get your structure of the glomerulus damaged, you're gonna have problems with your kidneys. Okay, tell me about hydrostatic versus oncotic pressures. Anybody remember what the hydrostatic pressures are? How big is the afferent and how big is the efferent? Which one's larger and which one's smaller? So afferent is larger, the efferent is smaller. You've got to maintain a certain blood pressure going through the glomerulus in order to get it filtered properly. What is bad removed, so it's sent out in the filtrate. And remember, when we talk about filtrate, that is what becomes urine. That's in your tubules. When we talk about what's reabsorbed, you're talking about reabsorbing it back into your bloodstream. So it depends on what bloodstream, where it's at in the tubules, what's surrounding it. If it's in the PCT or the DCT, it's going back in the paratubular capillaries. If it's in the loop of Henle, it's going back into the vasa recta. So remember, the blood is in the blood, the various blood around the tubules, and the filtrate becomes the urine that's within the tubule. So keep that straight. Because sometimes you get confused. Wait a minute, what do you mean reabsorbed? Are you talking about in the urine? No, reabsorption in the bloodstream. So hydrostatic, you're going to maintain that blood pressure in the glomerulus by adjusting the size of the afferent going into a small diameter. If you have this big of a diameter going into the diameter of my finger of an efferent, that's going to be pretty much blood pressure. You're going to help the glomerulus. The glomerulus, one book says less than 50,000, one book says 70,000 molecular weight. Anything less than 70,000 molecular weight can go into the filtrate. Larger molecules, an example would be glucose, is too big to get through because it's bigger than 70,000. It shouldn't get through into the fenestrated pores, into the filtrate at all. So if you damage the glomerulus like in strep, you're going to have a ton of stuff spilling over and it won't just be the proteins. Okay? The other thing we're going to talk about when we get to a little bit further into it is the shield of negativity. Albumin is a very small protein, and that's what, when we get into the chemical dipstick, your chemical dipstick for protein primarily detects albumin. Albumin is very small. So you're saying, shoot, if I have too much albumin, it's less than 70,000, it should spill, but it doesn't because it is a positive charge. And they won't go through into the pores, out to the filtrate. They will stay in the bloodstream. So unless there's a problem, you guys shouldn't have albumin except trace because some people have orthostatic. So the size will be affected of what gets through if you have damage to that glomerulus or if some of these processes get impacted. So generally albumin, even though it's a small molecule, it should be retained into your blood. It shouldn't be in your urine, okay? So this is the difference of size of your afferent to your efferent. And you should know that the afferent is larger going into a smaller efferent, so you're going to maintain a good blood pressure. Okay, so we talked about that. Oncotic, you have a lot of proteins that are present in your blood. And normally, they would draw more water into it. So it says larger proteins and even smaller ones like albumin tend to draw fluid, water, into the glomerulus to help maintain the blood pressure. So for the test, you got to know two pressures that help maintain the blood pressure in the glomerulus. Remember, if you have a low blood pressure in the glomerulus, you're not going to filter out the waste as good. So you got to maintain a good blood pressure. So you need to know hydrostatic, the afferent is larger than the efferent, and oncotic, the presence of these proteins, large and small, because we have a lot of proteins, amino acids, albumin. I don't know if you learned anything with transferrin maybe in hematology, if you heard transferrin as a protein. They tend to draw water to balance them out, which maintains the higher blood volume, the higher blood pressure. Okay, so this is the second system that helps filtration. The third one is the RAAS, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And this is where we're going to feel the effects of aldosterone, and also we'll talk about ADH. So if you know, aldosterone helps absorb sodium, ADH helps reabsorb water. Okay? So, and we talked about that surrounding them. Talked about the salt concentration, which is key. Okay, we did the 7, and then we're at the 3 of those. So everybody put total renal. How did we state that? That everybody has that written correctly.
1200 mils per minute for total renal blood flow.
Okay, write that correctly. Total renal blood flow, 1200 mils per minute. That way everybody has it the same. Now this is something that you got to know too when we get into the disease states. When you have the filtrate leaving the glomerulus, it always is at 1.010. And that shouldn't be what it is when you're done concentrating your urine, when it goes through the loop of Henle, through the distal, through the collecting duct. Maybe every once in a while you have a 1.010, but if you have every urine that is 1.010, that is saying something's wrong in your concentrating ability, because it shouldn't, when you're going through that loop of Henle, which has a high sodium chloride concentration, you shouldn't be a steady, stagnant 10. So that's a clue for the physician. If this patient is in the hospital and every day their urine is that, they need to do further kidney tests, because there's something wrong in the concentrating ability. So that's, I've seen that as a registry question. So this is what they say. Sometimes you'll see the filtrate called ultrafiltrate or filtrate. That's what it is leaving the glomerulus. If that's not where final concentration takes place, it shouldn't be that on a regular basis. Okay, so we already talked about the cellular structure, and we already talked about the hydrostatic and oncotic pressures. So this system is in relation to how does your body respond when there's low blood pressure and low sodium. And I thought this was good too on the juxtamedullary. Anybody know where the cells are from that determine your level of sodium, and they determine that you have a low blood pressure? Have you heard of the juxtamedullary complex or apparatus? Okay, you have the macula densa, and I think I put a picture. They have a picture, I think it's in Strassenger, that's good. So the macula densa, between that and the afferent arteria cells, they form the juxtamedullary apparatus that senses when you need to adjust the blood pressure by adjusting your sodium level. And then you'll see where aldosterone comes into play by reabsorbing it more. So naturally, if you pull more sodium into your bloodstream, you also try to pull more water into the bloodstream to dilute it or make it equal strengths. So remember, to increase your blood pressure, pull in more sodium, pull in more water, the blood pressure in the glomerulus goes up. So the bottom line, these three things have to work on keeping the blood pressure at a good level to get true waste products out of you, okay? So it's all about maintaining the blood pressure in the glomerulus, and these three systems all play a role. Okay, so this one, in response to a low sodium, what happens? And this would be a good chart to study for your test, okay? You have low blood pressure, low plasma, sodium. The macula densa secretes renin, which then works on an inactive precursor to form angiotensin 1. Then there's an enzyme called ACE that forms angiotensin 2, and this occurs in the lungs. Okay? And this was a good chart, I think, in Strassinger I pulled in. And it helps in these four ways. It helps vasoconstriction, which we have the larger afferent, smaller efferent, so it helps those size differences. It helps reabsorb sodium in the PCT, because remember, where did we say reabsorption in the PCT is nutrients? It is a spot for amino acids, sodium chloride, glucose, your nutrients it reabsorbs. Then it triggers the release of the hormone aldosterone, and that's produced by adrenal cortex. That one is the hormone that says, hey, wait a minute, I need more sodium reabsorbed. We need to maintain the blood pressure, so we got to have more sodium in the blood. And then it also triggers ADH from your hypothalamus to collect water in the collecting duct. Remember, it's going to balance out the sodium, so you have more sodium, more water, the blood pressure goes up, and you maintain that blood pressure. So what you have to tell me are the three things that help maintain blood pressure in the glomerulus so you have normal filtering of the waste products. So this, the glomerulus, anything less than 70,000 can be filtered out into the filtrate from the bloodstream. And albumin typically isn't because of the shield of negativity, because it's positive. The fenestrated pores help lead into the tubule. Then the two pressures, the hydrostatic pressure is your afferent to efferent, different sizes, the larger to the smaller, that helps the blood pressure. And then your oncotic pressures, just your typical presence of proteins like albumin, it helps absorb more water to balance it out, which increases your blood pressure. So think of water as a good thing to help maintain blood pressure, adding to kind of offset how many proteins are there. And then we'll see here, helping the blood pressure, when you get more sodium, it wants more water too. Okay, so tell me, what do you remember about the difference of diabetes mellitus versus diabetes insipidus? Mellitus you already had with Barb. What is that one? Excess what in the bloodstream?
Glucose.
Glucose. And then excess what in the urine if it's not taken, like your dad? They had spillage because it surpassed what? 160 to 180 is what is called the renal threshold of glucose. So typically, up to that point, you shouldn't have spillage. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, glucose is a big molecule. It shouldn't spill over. If you surpass the renal threshold, it's going to be forced out into the filtrate from the bloodstream because your blood says, wait a minute, I'm saturated. I can't handle anymore. Okay, so you'll have to be able to explain renal threshold as well. So you're saying glucose is too big, it shouldn't be out into the filtrate. it should have been maintained in the blood, but if it surpasses the renal threshold, it's gonna be passed into the blood. I mean, it's gonna be passed into the filtrate. So remember, yes,
Say like just for one day you have like a lot of concentrated sweets or carbs, can it just go into your urine?
I think most of us, when we have normal insulin production, can handle whatever we eat. I'm sure all of us have had too much sugar at some point that we've eaten. But I think most of us don't have a problem with our insulin handling the excess sugar. But if you're diabetic, and your dad is supposedly what, a type 2?
He was borderline, but I forgot the day before we went to the ball game and he had like 5 beers. Would that spike it that much?
Yep.
Because he said he went to the doctor the week before and he said he was within range. So.
Well, we'll see. You're gonna bring it in, aren't you?
Yeah, tomorrow.
Yeah. I would test him both times this week and we'll see. So, yes.
My father gave me his sheet where the doctor's been checking his blood sugars A1C over the past year. There's been one time where it shot over 300, otherwise it was 120, 130.
But that
Shot.
hemoglobin A1C though, what is it, like 5? It should be under 5 if it's normal,
4 to 6, I think it's.
something like that. And that's the better one. Why is the hemoglobin A1C better than the daily glucose?
Because you can see for months.
You can't cheat on the hemoglobin A1C.
But that's what I could have sworn that's what I was looking at, was his A1C, but it was like 131.
No, A1C would only be like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That sounds more the glucose. So my dad was a diabetic and he would try to cheat. He 2 days before he had the doctor's appointment, hardly eat anything. But every other time he'd do the buffets, he'd do his popcorn every night. Well, the hemoglobin A1C came back and you're not following your diet because it was bad. I don't know if it was 10 or 11. So he found out he can cheat the glucose, daily glucose, but he can't cheat the hemoglobin A1C, which would be good for your dad to have ordered, because the hemoglobin A1C, yes.
So I was watching TV the other day and they had a diabetic commercial came on and it talked about this medicine, I don't remember what it was, but it talked about lowering A1C. Would that be considered like cheating too? Because you could.
Well, I'm sure the diabetic pill farms try to enhance something, either enhance the action of insulin. So it probably is enhancing something in the processing of that glucose. Not that then will ultimately help the A1C to be within range.
Gotcha.
There's so many different drugs. Now I'm not really sure how each one attacks,
Yeah.
how insulin handles the sugar. All of us would do better to eat smaller, multiple meals than overloading any one time. Those fast sugars, especially like the sweets and anything. Probably fruits and vegetables are more complex, take longer to break down. But every one of us could benefit from smaller, more frequent meals than overloading. Because I said to my dad, you can't just go to a buffet and have whatever thousands of calories in one. Oh, I only ate once that day. That's terrible, Dad. I said, your insulin can't handle all that. So it'd have been better to break it out into 6 meals, some of that buffet, over 6 time frame, so it could handle it better. So typically, all of us should be able to handle if our insulin is working properly. So that's the big deal.
What about while you're pregnant?
I'm sorry, what?
What about while you're pregnant? Is it harder on your body to handle?
I think that baby is a parasite and it's going to take everything from you. Well, no, really. It takes from you first. You're the one hurt. If something goes wrong, it's usually the mom. The baby is taking everything it can get first from the mom. And I'm not sure what triggers the insulin not being able to handle the glucose properly with pregnancy, but it is very common. But I think pregnancy is very tough. It's a process where you're supporting another life and they get everything first. So I think it's amazing how many people have no prenatal care and have these healthy babies. Because there's so much that, you need to take care of yourself as a mom so that you don't get damaged. But yeah, I'm not really sure why the insulin can't keep up with the glucose production. with a lot of women. And it tends to be in women who were big babies or they had big babies. Because I have a girlfriend who is fit as anything. She's my age and you should see how fit she is. She has not an ounce of fat on her. She bikes, she runs, everything. And she's a full-blown insulin-dependent diabetic now. And she got it in her second pregnancy. And her first baby was, I think, 8-something. I don't think they were ever over 9 pounds. And she's got it full-blown. And a lot of times you will then end up going into diabetes down the road. And you would look at her and think, there's no way you're diabetic.
In this instance, would it come from like the mother side of the family, or could you get it from the father side of the family also?
Well,
Because my boyfriend, he was like an 11-pound baby.
I don't know. But I don't know how, it says if you've had a big baby or you were a big baby, I mean, he would contribute to the baby size. So have you asked to have that, because you said you already had your gestational test
I had mine
already.
done early, and they'll do it again in 24 weeks.
I was just gonna wait. But
So we'll see.
if
Who else had something we want to test again? You and you. You bring your urines in
So
and
we
your
need to get
dad's.
cups for tomorrow?
I'm going to the hospital starting tomorrow.
Okay.
But there's 3 of them I want them to keep. Because anybody else have anything we want to keep monitoring? Mainly if we wanted to keep monitoring if you had something. Otherwise, just those 3 for sure. I wanted that we just check on you. Okay? So that's one thing you're going to have to relate to the renal threshold to what could be spilled out. Okay? So that's another thing that happens. If you're over that renal threshold, it's going to force its way, even if it's too big of a molecule, because your blood is saturated. So that's going to be on the test too, the renal threshold. And you got to explain it. It won't just be a short answer. You've got to explain what we mean by renal threshold surpassing it. Okay, so let's go back to, so the low sodium causes decrease in water retention. So if you don't have a lot of sodium in the bloodstream, you're not going to retain more water. Then you don't have enough blood pressure going through the glomerulus. So the macula densa senses this and responds by renin in the juxtaglomerular cells. Then renin reacts with angiotensinogen, and it produces this angiotensin 1, and this passes through the lungs and by an enzyme is converted to the angiotensin 2. And then that's where those 3 things on that chart. So I would study the chart form. I think it's pretty compact, the chart that was just on there, and that was from Strassinger. So it dilates the afferent arterial and constricts the efferent, so it affects the hydrostatic, which we all agreed. That's one way to help get the pressure there. It stimulates reabsorption of sodium in the proximal tubule. And remember, that is the area where a lot of nutrients are reabsorbed. It triggers the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex and ADH from the pituitary gland. And ADH, another name for it is vasopressin. So if you hear that, it's one of the same. Therefore, blood pressure and sodium levels increase. Then naturally, once they increase, renin doesn't need to do its job anymore, and it'll decrease the amount. So renin is mainly secreted in response to a low sodium. So the 3 things that affect filtration: structure of the glomerulus of Bowman's capsule, less than 70,000 go through, hydrostatic and oncotic pressures, and then the RAAS, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So on that chart, what was the page 78? All I want you to put in this area is, let me turn back. All I want to put here is takes place here. So just where you know where it takes place. The chart is more for the passive and active reabsorption. What we're gonna do on secretion is we're just gonna give 3 things that help maintain blood pH of 7.4. Okay? That's all we're going to do on this side. On your test, you'll just get this piece. You'll have to fill out a chart of passive and active for reabsorption. But I wanted you to see, okay, takes place here, and you'll have to know those 3 things that help filtration that are on the board. Okay? So the RAAS system is what helps you to adjust when you have a low sodium and naturally a low blood pressure, because there's not as much water helping to maintain the balance between the sodium and the water in the glomerulus. Oops. Okay, so that's filtration and what you got to know. And that's for next week's test. So this is all test 2. Tubular reabsorption, there's active and passive. Active always involves a carrier molecule. I can't talk, I'm sorry, you guys. The sinus is like, ugh. It helps bring it and get it to the membrane and to be crossed, usually some carrier molecule like an albumin. Passive transport, you think of water trying to dilute something out to balance it out in equal concentration. It just normally high goes to low to balance out the concentration. They call that passive. Primarily this will be water. And does everybody remember where water is reabsorbed everywhere but where? If you remember that, you don't have to remember all the places, just know where it's not reabsorbed. It's the ascending loop of Henle. So it is everywhere. So on your chart, you can right away put water everywhere but the ascending loop of Henle.
Or passive.
Passive. Okay? So that's your most common passive molecule reabsorbed is water. And there's a thing called the osmotic gradient. And the ascending loop of Henle is impermeable to water being reabsorbed for a reason. That's where sodium and chloride are reabsorbed. And it wants to keep that medulla area, especially the juxtaglomerulus nephrons, it wants to keep a high level of sodium chloride in that area. And so it is impermeable to water on the ascending loop. So if you remember, it's everywhere but that. That at least gets you a start. Then you don't have to remember everywhere, you just have to know where it's not. Active transport, and I did put I have it in a chart form, so we can fill out the chart once we get to the chart that I took from Strassinger. So remember, the metabolic substances are reabsorbed primarily in the proximal. Okay? So you think of things that nutrients that you need back. Glucose, any glucose that is spilled over, they'll try to reabsorb it in the proximal if possible. If you haven't surpassed the renal threshold. If somehow the glucose gets spilled over, it's going to try to reabsorb it here. Amino acids. Salts, if you just want to write above it, sodium chloride, that's the only salt I'll have you know for this. Another thing reabsorbed actively is chloride, and it's the ascending loop of Henle. And sodium is also actively reabsorbed. We already know with sodium chloride in the proximal, but it is also reabsorbed actively in the distal. Okay? And we already know that you're going to have to discuss the renal threshold in relation to glucose, which at least that's something you should have heard about too a little bit already with Barb, so that should be something you're a little bit familiar with. So we have a chart that'll come up that will fill it out. passive transport, water is in everywhere but the ascending. And you can add distal too, because even the book has it shown in the distal. And then urea, even though we know that's a waste product, some urea is passively reabsorbed in the proximal and the ascending loop of Henle. And then sodium is passively in the ascending loop of Henle. So sodium is probably going to be your hardest one because it's passive and active. Sometimes it needs a transport molecule and sometimes it doesn't. And so you got to know the two hormones. When you're talking about the final concentration of what the specific gravity is going to be at the end, the key thing is how much water and how much sodium chloride is reabsorbed in the loop of Henle. And ADH is going to control how much water is needed, and aldosterone is going to help control how much sodium is reabsorbed. Remember, the lower the blood pressure, the more sodium your body's going to try to reabsorb, and why renin will be secreted. So I took this chart from Strassinger because I think everybody, it's easier to read chart form, I think, than written words. So I thought this was good. So I tried to pull some things from Strassinger because they sometimes go into a little bit more depth in Strassinger than the graph book. But like I said, graph had probably the better pictures. So active transport, if you want to get this chart out. So you tell me on passive, we'll put Na here, Na here. In the proximal tubule, what is passively reabsorbed? Water.
Urea and water.
And urea. What's in the descending loop of Henle?
Water.
Water. What is in the ascending loop of Henle?
Urea and sodium.
And that is passively. And in the distal, we're going to keep water everywhere. So at least put water everywhere. Okay? So does everybody have, let me show you what I have written and make sure everybody's written the same way. This is in nothing. I didn't want Na to people to think it's the sodium. So does everybody have water, urea, then urea, sodium, and then water and water? Because this is the chart you're going to have to fill out on the test. You're going to get a chart and you're going to have to know what is passively reabsorbed and what is actively reabsorbed. Okay, so tell me now on the active. Let's go back to the chart, and then we'll fill it in, and then I'll put my chart up to make sure everybody has it. Okay, tell me what is actively reabsorbed in the proximal.
Glucose, amino acids, and sodium chloride.
Yeah. And then we'll put salts, but we'll put in parentheses sodium chloride. What about the descending loop of Henle? Anything active? Okay, so we'll put nothing because I don't want people to see Na and think it's sodium. Ascending loop of Henle, what's actively reabsorbed?
Chloride.
Chloride. And distal?
Sodium.
Sodium, and then collecting nothing.
Na.
Okay, so let's make sure everybody's chart is the same, and then you know it's directly from the Strassinger book. Okay, so nothing, the glomerulus, all I'm worried about is filtration. Okay, so we have glucose, amino acids, salts, and I put in parentheses sodium chloride. And we have nothing in the descending loop of Henle. We have chloride in the ascending. We have sodium in the distal. And then we have nothing. So is everybody on the same page? So this is put study for test 2. that I'll give you a chart and it'll say passive and active, and you'll have to fill in the chart, okay? You won't have to fill in a chart for filtration or secretion, but I thought you'd have one page to study. Yes?
Could you say sodium was active in the approximately?
Let's see. Maybe I have that wrong on my PowerPoint. Let's take it.
It was on there.
For
It
active?
was on the, yeah.
Is it here?
It's on
Active.
table.
Active. There is proximal and distal. Do we not have it listed? So we need it here. No, we have
Where
sodium.
glucose is, amino acids,
Proximal
were
tubules.
proximal.
Yes, here's sodium.
Well, that's with the salt, but it's also, it's also without the salt, right?
Right. Yeah, I think I said it's covered in the salt, and that's the only salt I'm gonna have you know, sodium chloride. So the sodium is covered there. Okay? So as long as you know salts and sodium chloride, that covers the salt, or the sodium part of it. You don't have to know separately.
So it's just sodium chloride as salt, there's no sodium inside the
But
proximal tubule.
It will too,
It's
sodium
both.
ions.
it's sodium and chloride, but you can just know it as salts, and that's fine. If you write sodium chloride, that covers it. You won't have to write them separately. Okay? Okay, so that chart is from Strassinger, and I kind of like some of their stuff. Okay, so that's filtration and reabsorption, what you gotta know. And this is something, at least you need to know the term, the countercurrent multiplication or mechanism in the vasa recta. This helps provide absorption of water from the descending loop and resorption of solute without water in the ascending loop. The ascending loop of Henle or limb is impermeable to water, okay? So it's going to be heavily concentrated. They call it the interstitium between leaving the loop of Henle and going to the vasa recta, all that tissue, the interstitium. And it's very heavy with sodium chloride, okay? And this is key to concentrating your urine properly. So water moves in the opposite direction, out of the descending loop and back into, and it's maintained in the filtrate. It is not any water that would be remaining in the filtrate as it goes up the ascending stays there. If there's sodium that it's saying, hey, wait a minute, you got a lot of sodium in the interstitium, I want to leave to go balance it out, it can't. It won't allow it. So it stays heavily concentrated with the sodium chloride in that interstitium. So it's heavily concentrated with sodium chloride. What would be the tendency of water to go dilute it, to balance it out, but the ascending loop won't let it. And this is a key piece to concentrating your urine by the end product. So just be aware, I won't test you on this, but they call that the countercurrent. Normally, water would say, wait a minute, I want to get out there and dilute out that sodium chloride, but it won't let it. It maintains it, okay? And they just call that the countercurrent.
Is it kind of like two magnets with a wall between it?
Right, but it won't let it. Normally, water goes out everywhere, but not in the ascending loop. So the last piece that you got to know for your test is what helps maintain. I think there was a good picture that I wanted to show you. What helps maintain the blood pH? So secretion is all about maintaining the blood pH. And this, I wanted to show you this picture on Strassinger. I thought this was pretty good. Before we move into that. So this is where it's showing you, it's not, sodium chloride is out into the interstitium and then going into the bloodstream, but it won't allow the water. Whereas water on the descending is allowed to join the bloodstream, but this is impermeable on the ascending loop, And this is what they're talking about, maintaining a high amount of solute, the sodium chloride, in the interstitium, when the natural tendency of water would be to follow it. Wait a minute, I got to dilute that out. So that's what they're talking about with the countercurrent. And it's in both the Strassinger book and there too. So that was something I thought was good in the Strassinger book. The other thing, Strassinger book, I thought had a good picture of the three mechanisms. Okay? So, if you're going to take a picture of anything of the Strassinger book, in this one here, it's page 46. I'm not sure the page number and the Strassinger there, but it's really good about showing you the three processes of what happens to the excess hydrogen. So, one substance, you got to know the three substances it combines with, and which one is reabsorbed to help make the blood tend to be more alkaline, and which two are excreted with the excess hydrogen. Remember, we have a very acidic urine, typically, and what is excreted with them to carry the excess hydrogen. Okay, so the first one is the one, in general, secretion serves two processes. And the three things you got to know is for this process. It will eliminate waste products that normally maybe don't get carried out or pass through the glomerulus because they're too big. Some things like medications, if they're with a protein carrier like albumin, they can be secreted into the filtrate and pass through the urine at the proximal tubule. So some things are not involved with elimination. They just happen at the proximal tubule. An example is medications. That's one function of secretion. Biggest function of secretion is maintaining the blood pH. Okay? The first thing it does is to bring back bicarbonate. And they show you this, I'll show you the little formulas they have here. So HCO3, when it comes back into the bloodstream, is alkaline, and it helps to make the blood pH towards the alkaline side, not towards the acidic side. So bicarbonate is reabsorbed into the bloodstream. So you got to know there's going to be the phosphate, the ammonia, and the bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is the one that's reabsorbed into the bloodstream, and it helps to be more alkaline. So the 7.4. So on secretion, you got to be able to tell me which one, and I'll show you how the hydrogen ion breaks off. So HCO3 minus is reabsorbed. And reabsorbed always means back into the blood. And the pH, it helps maintain the pH in the body of 7.4. But we still got to get rid of the extra hydrogen. So let's look at the first diagram they have of the bicarbonate. Okay, so this bicarbonate is reabsorbed back into the peritubular plasma. So that happens in the peritubular capillaries around the proximal. Okay? Then the two that join the extra hydrogens are phosphate ion. Let me see how I wrote that. HPO4. So phosphate, if you at least know phosphate, and then NH4 plus ammonium ion. These excrete excess hydrogen. They take any extra excess hydrogen present in the filtrate and help them be excreted in the urine. So let me show you those diagrams. So all you got to know for the test for me is which one is reabsorbed, which ion is reabsorbed to help the blood pH go closer to alkaline, and which two help join any excess hydrogen ions and help excrete them as urine. And that's the ammonium and the phosphate. So here's the one that binds with okay, so that's the bicarbonate. Here is the HPO4 joining with the hydrogen, and it goes out in the tubular lumen. The tubular lumen is the urine. Okay, so that goes out in the urine, and that's the phosphate ion. And then the ammonium, this is, and when it says tubular lumen, that's out in the urine. Ammonia forms in your metabolism. It joins with the hydrogen, and it forms the ammonium ion, and that goes out in the urine. So you got to know what is reabsorbed to help maintain the alkaline nature of the blood. That is the bicarbonate. And the two substances that are secreted with the excess hydrogen to get rid of any excess hydrogen left from metabolism, which makes your urine more acidic, the more hydrogen ions you have, that is ammonia and phosphate ion. So let's go to that chart, and we'll fill in those three things. Okay, so if you get your page 78 out. So most of what you have to know for the test is this chart and the three things that we had listed on what helps filtration, okay? That is the key thing for your test. So the one that, the bicarbonate ion,
Changing your screen's blue.
I must keep hitting the wrong button. Back it up. Okay, the bicarbonate ion helps maintain the blood pH of 7.4, and then the phosphate ion and the ammonium ion, numbers 2 and 3, help get rid of excess hydrogen ions in urine. Bicarbonate is reabsorbed into the blood. Okay? So you got to realize the bicarbonate ion is reabsorbed into the blood, and the two processes that help get rid of the excess hydrogen left over are the phosphate ion and the ammonium ion. Okay? So, and then we can go look at your study guide too when we're done. And that will be kind of a recap. Okay, so does everybody have bicarbonate ion reabsorbed into the blood, helps maintain the pH of 7.4, and then phosphate ion and ammonium ion, numbers 2 and 3, help get rid of excess hydrogen. Okay, so that you need to know for test 2, that whole thing. And in filtration, if you want to add, if somewhere on this chart you want to add the 3 things that help filtration, the structures of the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, that if you want to write it, then you kind of have it all on one page. So the structures, I'm just going to put structures. You can put a glomerulus and Bowman's capsule, the hydrostatic / oncotic pressures, and the third thing is the RAAS, in response to low sodium. So if that helps you to know what makes filtration better, then you kind of have one sheet that has it all on it. Okay? So that's kind of what you have to know for the test, is that whole sheet. You're going to get questions about the filtration and questions about secretion. You're going to have to fill out a chart for active and passive. Okay? That'll be a chart form. Yes.
What day is test 2 on?
Test 2 would be next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday?
Yeah.
Are our tests going to be every Wednesday through?
It won't be the week I have to leave. I'm gonna do everything in 2 days. So I haven't given you a week 3 and 4 schedule, but this is week 2. Next week you'll have the same, a Wednesday test. But week 4, we've got to decide. Barb wants to do her test on the Wednesday because she's gonna teach you Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I'm gonna teach you 6 hours and 6 hours Monday and Tuesday of that week. So we've got to decide what day do you want my test on, if you want it on Monday or if you want it on Tuesday. So as we get to next week, we won't say which day till you see how you're feeling about the material.
It's not going to be from Monday's holiday.
No, following
Next week is week 3 and Monday's a
the
holiday.
12th and 13th.
We're already gonna swap hours on Tuesday because she's gonna want to give you her test at 8. So she's gonna go 8 to noon on Tuesday, and I'm gonna go noon to 2. But I'll give you a schedule. I haven't put the schedule out for week 3 and 4 yet. But since she misses the whole holiday, instead of me giving her tests and me doing urines and me then switching back to chemistry, she's just gonna take the first 4 hours. And then I'll go to the hospital during the morning and see if they have more urines before we have class at noon. Yes?
We step back, what's on exam?
You had test route 1 review sheet I put out on Blackboard. All the way through number 1, the renal blood supply. The first 7, when you got to write them in order, and the structures of the renal blood supply on that. Yeah. So only through the names of the renal blood supply and the diagram putting them on it. Yes.
You said something about the reading, the first page of review, ASCP cards. Did you?
Yep.
Is
You
that
got
their
the
booklet?
yellow booklet I gave you called the ASCP cards. That is, I might give you some of those pages too, because that book's good. That booklet's great, and so I think I put page
Sure.
1 all the urine composition, and you have it in your book too. But that also goes over what happens to urine when it sits. So I wanted to show you that little review cards are good.
And it's
So I'm going to try to use them too on the test, so it forces you to look at them kind of as we go.
What about the graph page? Is that in here too?
That's your textbook.
That you gotta. I left a graph textbook. I left the newest edition for you to
Test
take
2
pictures
materials on
of
test 1?
over there Friday, because I have the old edition right here. But the book was over there. Anybody needs to take pictures of the study questions and the key before. I even had them paper clipped. I think I had the paper clip and where the key was and the paper clip where it is. So if anybody needs to take a picture, take it before you leave today on the new book.
Here, this book right here.
Yeah, I left my new book for you guys. I took the old one home. Okay, so let's look at your study questions, and then we'll review, and we'll be done at by 1:30. Because we can still review some tomorrow too, but I mean, might as well not waste the time and get some review in. Okay.
Let me put on my recorder.
Okay. So try not to look at anything right now. So you already named them when we started, the 7 blood vessels. That'll be on test 1. So on your key, because I already had the key, I had the key out through that, and then after, I'll put the key out to this before we study for test 2. Name how does filtration occur in the glomerulus? So name the 3 things. Try to name them without looking.
RAAS.
RAAS, one of them. Hydrostatic, oncotic,
Structure.
and going through the structure. So if there's any damage to the glomerulus, the Bowman's capsule, and they talk about that shield of negativity, where it won't let things like albumin pass through, even though it's a small molecule, it should be able to pass through. It'll try to retain it because it's a positively charged substance. Okay, so who wants to try to explain to me how the RAAS system makes the blood pressure better so that you have better filtration? What senses that you have a low sodium and low blood pressure? Okay, and so then what is secreted first? What hormone? No, not yet.
Albumin?
No, what is the kidney hormone that try to, renin, okay? Then what does renin act on first?
Angiotensin.
Tensin,
One.
tensinogen, it becomes angiotensin,
Angiotensin.
and then it goes where? To the lungs, and is converted by an enzyme, I think they call it ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, in the lungs to angiotensinogen 2, and then it triggers the release of the two hormones from where? Aldosterone
And
from the
ADH.
adrenal cortex and ADH from the pituitary. And what does aldosterone do? Increases reabsorption of sodium, okay? ADH is what's going to help you to reabsorb more water. So the sodium naturally is reabsorbed into the bloodstream, which draws more water into the bloodstream, and the blood pressure goes up. And then once the blood pressure goes up, it says to renin, okay, we don't need you anymore. We've got a good blood pressure being maintained in the glomerulus. And then what the hydrostatic difference of afferent
And
being
efferent.
large versus efferent, and then the oncotic pressures are just generally
Protein.
the presence of more proteins, and they give an example of albumin, encourages the addition of more water to balance them out, dilute them out, and that increases the blood volume. So your goal with filtration is you gotta maintain this blood pressure to get the stuff filtered out that you need to. Okay, so tell me, so that kind of went over 3 and 4. Tell me, can you remember anything about you'll have to just study the passive and active. At least you should be able to tell me water. Everybody should at least get water correct. Where is it reabsorbed passively? Everywhere but.
A, C, and D.
Okay, so at least put that down right away. At least you know you got all those points right. Then remember what we said about the proxima likes to reabsorb nutritional substances back into it. So think of what are some stuff actively reabsorbed. Glucose, amino acids,
And salts.
salts, the sodium chloride, okay? And then what, do you remember what is actively? I think the active side is a little easier to study than the stuff besides water on passive. Remember what's actively reabsorbed in the ascending, back into the bloodstream?
Sodium.
Chloride. In the distal, what's actively reabsorbed?
Sodium.
Sodium. Okay, I think sodium is probably going to be your hardest because it's a few places. Okay, back to passive, you still have one thing that's passively reabsorbed in the proximal besides water is urea. And I think that was a hard one because you're thinking, why is urea reabsorbed anyway? Because it's a waste product. And the ascending loop of Henle, when you had said sodium, it's just chloride actively. Passively, it's urea and sodium in the ascending. I think that's going to be your hardest one, the extra things that are passive besides water. So that is something you'll just have to study. And then, what is the specific gravity when the filtrate leaves the glomerulus before it gets into the tubules? 0.010. Okay? And then which substance is reabsorbed back in the bloodstream to help maintain the 7.4 pH? Bicarbonate. And which two substances are excreted as urine holding the extra hydrogen ions?
Phosphate and ammonia.
And ammonia. Okay. And then I think I have that chart, I'll have that on the answer key as well.
Is it ammonia or ammonium?
Ammonium ion is what it's called when it's NH4+, it's called ammonia when it's NH3. So it's ammonium ion and phosphate ion when it excretes that. Okay, so that would be test 2, okay? So let's talk about test 1. Oh, let me give you back the pages I have of yours that I graded. I'll let you two pass each group out. I put these right away in your portfolio. I'll grade the rest of the portfolios today, so you should have them back on your desk by tomorrow. And I've really thoroughly enjoyed the reflective papers. I think that has been the best thing I've added to the portfolio. And I love Diane's idea of having the letter to yourself. You know, what would you say to yourself if you had to, you know, what you know now versus when you first began? I even thought one year my group that had Portia, I think it was 2000. Did you guys have a letter at some of your desks taped too? I was thinking in 150, you guys might have had some of your letter taped to your desk. Portia was really nice. I found one of hers and I kept it in the podium. That she wrote encouraging letter to whoever sat in her station to the class before, after them. And I thought it was really nice, a nice thing to do for future students who haven't been there yet, the whole process. And the reflective letters, I think, remind me of that. Seeing how far you've grown, even in just 3 short classes. So that has been hands down my favorite. Recommendations, some of them I had a hard time finding. So, some of the CEUs. So this is what I would recommend, because those are big pieces, the reflective piece and the CEUs. I would want every potential employer that doesn't know us to be able to see them. And if you're going to put a CEU within the class, I would make it your last thing on your outline. Personally, I would put the reflective papers either in a miscellaneous or their own tab saying reflective papers. When you got so much in each class, it's kind of hard to find it sometimes, and those are things I'd want them to see. So probably if I was setting it up for scratch, I would have my CEUs in a little tab and my personal reflections, and just keep your class as your work from that class. And I had a few mixtures. I mean, some put the personal after heme, and sometimes the CEUs. If it was the front thing, it was easy, but if it was in the middle, it was hard. So if they're not, a lot of times they're going to say, oh my gosh, I'm not going to look at this all. But if they just glance at something, those are things I'd want them to glance at. Because that's a big deal to do that continuing education. I mean, to me, they think, wow, we do that with our techs here as they work. They either do CAP or MTS. So, bottom line, our goal is get the job and beat out other people. Whatever we can arm you with, you get the job that you want over somebody. I want to think of everything we can to make you more marketable. It doesn't matter if you pass our program. It's if you get the job and pass the test. Okay, so that would be my suggestions. I know some of you might would have to maybe make another tab or rewrite them, but I found a few. I was flipping through, trying to find them. You want it easy as possible for someone to look through if they only want to look through it for a few minutes. Okay? I made this big clinical binder and for my site visitors, and I want it as easy as possible. I want them to see their CLIA certificates. I want them to see the faculty fact sheets. I want them to see all their agreements, all their addendums. I mean, the more, you come across as very organized too with what you got in there. So, think of, I want to be, and a lot of you think, oh, well, if I only stay at the same place my whole career, that's fine. But you never know if you ever have to move, or for some reason you want a different experience. Okay. You have to do the diagrams. So what is your hardest piece you would want to review? Let's talk about lab a little bit, because there are gonna be lab questions. Tell me, what is key that you would worry about on the physical exam? What clarity would be what you would worry about the most on a fresh urine? Not
Cloudy.
turbid.
Cloudy.
Cloudy. Turbid, usually it happens when you take it from, you put it at body temp or room temp, into the refrigerator at 2 to 8, then you go ahead and you take it out, let it get back to room temp again, and a lot of times anything you might have dissolved solids will precipitate out, and then you can't see through it. So think of turbid as you can't see through it. Cloudy, Tiana's was a perfect one because you had just went, and you could tell it wasn't just a little, but you could still see through it. A fresh urine, and like I said, I'm gonna start bringing hospital urines this week, so we'll see if we can line some up. We get some different colors or clarities. And are you in the lab or are you at the draw station? If you would even ask them, are you ever there late?
They're kind of really-
Okay, why don't you do this? Why don't you see if this week, are you there tonight till midnight, or you got certain days off during the week?
I took tonight off, right?
So- Okay,
I'm
so
there every day otherwise.
otherwise you wanna check on Wednesday night, if you can say, hey, or even just say, if you get any good urines the next couple days, would you save them for me? And especially tell them we're trying to show differences in clarity.
But now, a patient that has
They-
pus in their urine, would that be considered turbid then?
Is it pus throughout? Because I haven't had too many urines that have had pus in my career. I mean, if you could bring one, do you guys had one recently that had it?
Well, I had one recently, like a patient that was calf, and the tube ended up filling up with white pus. So,
That's a mucus.
Huh?
That's a mucus.
It can be from white cells,
it was
Bacteria, yeah. You think pus, you associate
And
white
I've
cells
seen
infection.
it
If
once or
you
twice before.
tell them to look out for that.
Would you consider that turbid though?
Yeah, if you can't see
You
through
can't
it, you
see
call it
through it.
turbid. But it would also have indicators on the dipstick.
Okay.
You at least should see a lot of bacteria, you see a lot of white cells,
Right.
especially when you get to the microscopic if it's a gram positive. So that would be great, but if you wouldn't mind putting feelers out and say, since you are working in an environment that you could look to, and if they're very positive, it won't completely deteriorate. If they could just refrigerate a tube of it, that would be awesome. Yes?
What about if you have a sample that has mucus in it? I know when I was getting it from my calf.
Yeah, you're gonna have mucus in a lot of them for
Take that
women.
out in order to
No.
put your stick?
No, we're gonna spin it down and you're gonna try to, you wanna be able to see the cells in your thing. So when you're not gonna wanna do a stringy drop on your slide. But you're not gonna call that clear, and is mucus pathological? No, we're gonna do that next lecture. Mucus isn't pathological. So that's common. If it's a woman's urine, I expect a lot of women's urine to not be clear if it's first morning and concentrated. If it's throughout the day and they drank a lot of women's urine will be clear. But if it's first morning and it's been concentrated, I would say a lot of women might be hazy because of their mucus production. That's okay. Okay? So cloudy generally, but if you get an example of a pussy one, I've never done a pussy one in my whole career. So if you get one, bottom line, if it's turbid, you can't see through, put something that has lines behind it, you can't see those lines. And you're gonna be pathological if you see other stuff on the dipstick and under the microscope. But more often than not, a turbid is nothing more than change in the stuff, dissolved solids precipitating out. What about color? Do you remember anything? Do you remember even a couple pathological colors?
Amber.
Anything with reddish, or if the red cells start lysing, it might become brownish. You think of something with blood, and you see what your dipstick detect. It could detect fresh or intact, or hemoglobin if it's been lysed. So If someone has a hemolytic anemia, they're gonna have blood positive because of the hemoglobin. If someone has trauma to the kidney, maybe they have a UTI, maybe they've actually had trauma in the abdominal area, back area. Some people even running marathons get blood in their urine. So you've got to distinguish so you tell me, think about this. We're not gonna do the microscope, maybe the end of the week. I'm gonna see if Barb will come in early tomorrow so I can teach you the urine machine. Think about this. What would you see under the microscope, depending on if you have hemoglobin versus intact red cells? Red cells? Which one? Or both?
If they're hemolyzed, you shouldn't see any.
Right? You can report a large blood with 0 to 2 or none red cells if it's all hemoglobin. And I was worried when I'd have one like that and it had large blood and then I'm reporting none or 0 to 2 that the doctor's gonna realize they've all lysed. So there's no intact red cells. So if you have a hemolytic anemia and you have a large blood, you're not gonna see red cells under the microscope. But if you have, remember that dipstick detects both, the intact versus the hemolyzed. If it's intact red cells, like from a trauma, a UTI, you should see red cells that go along with the blood on the pad. The longer a urine sits, the more red cells lyse and the fewer you'll call. So by the time I go get them at 6:45 and we don't do the actual urine until 8:30, a lot of them are gonna lyse just in the normal process of the time frame. So that's one of them. Do you remember which color it becomes if it's bilirubin, like a liver problem? If it converts bilirubin to biliverdin, it becomes the greenish color, but when you get this deep gold brown, I call it amber a lot. It's on more leaning toward the brownish color than the yellow. That goes with liver problems, and a lot of times they think hepatitis, so you think, oh, we better handle that carefully. Well, you should handle them all carefully, but. So those two colors are pretty common, something in the reddish brown, or something in the dark yellow to amber color when they're fresh. We're talking fresh urines, not that have sat around. Why might you have an orange one? Do you ever remember what can sometimes trigger an orange?
Antibiotics.
So an antibiotic sometimes. Because you saw that chart that I had, it was a lot that showed normal that caused a lot of colors. And not as many really pathological that cause the color. So not every color is bad. Yes.
There's like it's like a pinkish red.
Uh-huh.
And that's from Vitamin, where it's like a azo brand for UTIs.
And it'll turn the urine?
It's so thick that the stain color in the urine, it burns it.
And what is it? What is it called that you can take?
Azo brand UTI. It's a cranberry.
Oh, so maybe the
No, it's
cream.
not the cranberry, well, it's like.
But it has that colorish, the magenta.
Yeah, it turns it.
Huh. Well, sometimes this is what I would do when I have a urine that was even too bloody. Because you gotta mix them well, do your dipstick, and then before you do the microscopic, you centrifuge it. So, if you guys wanna listen, if you have heavy duty blood, let's say a girl in a period, and no tampon, no pad, whatever, and it's a bloody urine, you're gonna have trouble reading your dipstick, okay? Because it's gonna change the colors. So we had a code that we could file unable to determine due to the color. But what I would do is I dip it with the color and put down whatever gave an actual result off the machine. Then I would also hand dip it, I'd centrifuge it and get all the red cells to the bottom of the tube. Then I dip it in the urine, and that's what I reported on the analytes.
So would the white cells fall as well, or would you lose anything else?
Well,
besides
I'm
red
gonna
cells?
do it both ways. So let's say the white cells, but you're still, even in the white cells, you're looking for leukocyte esterases, what's in them, so that should still be maintained. I mean, you're gonna do centrifuge for the sediment anyway, so that you're gonna still look at it under the microscope, yes.
With the drug testing, I actually had that issue and you couldn't see through it and there was supposed to be clarity and things like that. And they went ahead and passed me, would we have to accept another drug test that didn't have that much blood in it, or?
I know you're gonna do urine drug tests with Barb, so I'm not sure if the kits are interfered with by blood. It should say on whatever she has you do the kits. But, I'm just giving you little tips so you don't turn out wrong results. So you can't always count those results when it will change the pads because of the color of the urine, and it's not a problem. The girl was just menstruating, so it wasn't like she had a problem, but a lot of the pads won't be normal color, so think about that. Centrifuge, dip it, keep your results of what it ran with it mixed, and centrifuge it, then dip it before we pour it off to look at the sediment. So little tips will help you to not turn out bad results. Okay, so what would a diabetic mellitus specific gravity be? And what would a diabetes insipidus specific gravity be if that's part of the physical exam still? Who would be low and who would be normal? Insipidus would be low. They don't have enough ADH. ADH's job is to reabsorb water. So if you don't have enough ADH, which is diabetes insipidus, all that water is going out in your urine. None of it's coming back into the bloodstream. So it's going to be a very low specific gravity. And remember, you're measuring dissolved solids, and heavy particles like glucose factor in more than your sodium chloride. Then mellitus, why do you think you'd have a high specific gravity?
Because the water is being reabsorbed, or?
Well, what is glucose, should glucose be out in your urine? No, but it surpassed the renal threshold. It was forced out into the filtrate. It's a heavy molecule. So the heavier the molecule, the specific gravity is going to be higher.
Do children have a higher specific gravity or no?
We don't really have normals that vary in our book for children. It all is going to base on your hydration too. But we don't really in our textbook have different normals for kids versus adults.
My son was 1.035 when I brought it in last week.
Had he not voided for a long time?
The first time, yeah, it was
Yeah,
like 12
and-
hours, so.
I mean, anybody who pees through the night is going to have a less specific, won't be as concentrated as someone who didn't void for 8 to 10 hours and didn't get up at all in the middle of the night. Or you're someone that got up and drank water in the middle of the night, someone else didn't have anything to drink since supper. So there's lots of factors with the specific gravity. That is not the best indicator of how your urine is concentrated though. We'll get into something called osmolarity that is a better one, because specific gravity is affected by both weight and number of particles. Glucose has nothing to do with renal concentration. Sodium chloride is all about renal concentration. When we get to something called osmolarity, sodium chloride is what you want to evaluate in the renal concentration world. And it does not have as much effect from the glucose as specific gravity does. Okay, tell me in the chemical dipstick. You should be able to tell me this part for this test. What goes together for a UTI? Glucoside esterate. What goes with kidney function if it's elevated? Protein. What goes with diabetes mellitus if they're elevated? Glucose and ketones. What goes with liver disease if they're elevated? Something like hepatitis. Bilirubin and urobilinogen. And what goes with diabetes mellitus? What would you see on the dipstick? What else on the dipstick besides ketones and glucose would go with the diabetes insipidus?
Blood?
Specific gravity is going to be low. So, specific gravity is going to be high with diabetes mellitus. So you'll have specific gravity, glucose, ketones. Diabetes insipidus, what will you have on the dipstick? The low specific gravity. okay? But nothing else abnormal. Okay? So mellitus, you're gonna have the glucose ketones and a high specific gravity because glucose is in the urine and it's heavy. Diabetes insipidus, you're gonna have low specific gravity because you have no ADH, so the water is not being reabsorbed in the bloodstream, it's out. So remember, I'm gonna ask you some questions in related to what we did in lab based on those. Yes?
So the normal, specific gravity is like at 10, right?
No, the normal specific gravity, we can be in, one book says 3 to 30, another one might say 1.005 to 30. That's the normal specific gravity. The 1.010 is what it is after it leaves the glomerulus into the filtrate. Okay, and that would be more test tube. Okay, so tomorrow we'll review at the end of lab. So tomorrow we'll normal out. I'm gonna go to the hospital in the morning before we get here. I don't think too many of you ever get here before 7:30 anyway, but I will see how fast I get back from there, because I try to get there by 6:45. So I might not be here to open anything up before 7:30 to 7:45, depending on how fast I am to say names. So I just want to give you a heads up.